the Toronto Star. I'm Sara Mojtehedzadeh, and this matters. Have you recently felt followed while walking down the streets of Toronto and turned around to find yourself looking at a pink robot on wheels with hearts for eyes? If you have, then you know the robots are coming and they're bringing your food. There is a robot called Geoffrey on the loose in Toronto, a cheerful-looking droid who uses they-them pronouns. Geoffrey is run by a company that's offering contactless, affordable delivery at the tap of a smartphone. It's claiming to be an alternative that emphasizes buying local and safety during these pandemic times when all of us have increased our reliance on gig workers picking and dropping off our orders. But as Star reporter Sara Mojtehedzadeh found out, sometimes the way Geoffrey's run isn't local at all and raises some serious questions about its implications for essential gig workers who have already paid the steepest price of COVID-19 as they continue to work so the rest of us could stay home. So what comes next for them as the pink robots arrive? The Star's work and wealth reporter Sara Mojtehedzadeh joins me to help explain. Hi Sara, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So clearly I've been living the quarantine life a little bit too well because I actually didn't know about Geoffrey before I read your piece. Tell me more. Who's Geoffrey? What do they do?
So Geoffrey is a little pink robot. They use the pronouns they, them. Some people who live in downtown Toronto may have seen them kind of traversing the streets. And they're essentially little robots that deliver food. They can deliver food within a 2-mile radius of restaurants. And when Geoffrey first kind of hit the streets, they were billed as this safer alternative, especially given COVID, to food delivery, because obviously it's low contact. So, since then on Instagram and Twitter, you definitely see people posting videos and photos of Geoffrey, and there's certainly a cute little presence in the streets of Toronto. But, I have sort of been peeling back the layers on what lies beneath.
Right. Like you said, you're peeling back the layers. I've seen the picture on your article. It's a cute little robot with hearts for eyes, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, right? Can you talk to me a little bit about who's behind this venture and how does Geoffrey actually operate?
Yeah, so Geoffrey is the sort of brainchild, I guess, of 2 former Uber engineers who, I guess, again, wanted a lower cost, low contact delivery option. And what I thought was interesting is that initially Geoffrey was operated, according to the company, by remote pilots based here in Toronto who were being paid $25 an hour. And then I noticed that there were some job postings going up for the company that invented Geoffrey, and they were based in the Philippines. So I sort of started digging into what that meant and learned that the company was looking to recruit remote operators, but this time as, sort of freelancers based in the Philippines. And so, for some, that definitely raises questions as to, what does the labor look like behind this cute kind of delivery robot?
Mm-hmm. That's something I do want to get into with you. Also, you mentioned that this kind of launched during pandemic times. So what's been the response like in Toronto by local restaurants and consumers, especially when dealing with COVID restrictions? And this seems to be a form of contactless delivery, right?
Yeah, I think that for restaurants, there's certainly been some interest. I think the company now partners with around 20 restaurants in Toronto, and the fees that they charge restaurants, I believe, are lower than what some of the food delivery apps charge. And, we really saw that sort of during the pandemic when restaurants were really struggling emerge as a major issue. And in fact, the provincial government instituted a temporary cap on the fees that app companies could charge these restaurants, because obviously, restaurants were struggling and are struggling. The cap has lifted. So again, I think the concerns around the cost of delivering food through these apps is certainly on the radar for restaurants. But, the other side of this is that this is a longstanding labor issue in terms of the workers who are making these deliveries and the safety concerns that they had during the pandemic, and the concerns around low pay, safety cycling around the streets. But for couriers, when I talked to couriers about their thoughts about Geoffrey, the concern was they'd gone from low wage kind of gig economy jobs to now their jobs being actually replaced by even lower wage positions in the Philippines.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you when we talk about AI, when we talk about automation. This question comes to mind. Are robots taking over our jobs? And like you said, there's some concerns there. But as you also mentioned in the article, it's not exactly that, right?
Yeah, I think, again, the uptake is still low, and I don't think we'd ever be in a scenario where these jobs are entirely replaced. I just don't think it's feasible in the near future. We're just not set up to have robots taking over the streets and, all the challenges in terms of urban planning that would cause. But I think the couriers that I talked to, they talked about these issues of safety, of pay. And for them, the solution is not to necessarily turn to technology. It's to fix the problems that not just couriers, but many urban residents face. Anyone who rides a bike in Toronto struggles with infrastructure problems. And so the solution that is good for food couriers is also good for Torontonians as a whole. And I think that the other major piece is this is just another reminder. A lot of this work that makes people's lives more convenient is actually hidden. Whether that is just tapping your phone and ordering food and someone drops it off in a matter of half an hour at your door, or if a robot does it and the remote pilot is actually based in the Philippines, that labor is often erased and we don't really think about what is going into us getting this really convenient kind of service to our doorstep.
We'll be right back. You're talking about this outsourcing that's taking place in remote pilots in the Philippines. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like other capitalist business ventures, clearly the global outsourcing for Geoffrey has already begun.
Yeah, this is one small piece of an enormous industry. In the Philippines in particular, it's been a growing source of sort of economic strategy for the country. It's sort of an inversion of the economic model that the country has relied on for a long time, which is overseas labor, essentially. We see that in our caregiving sector, migrant farm labor, for example. It's often low-wage workers coming from the Philippines with precarious immigration status in Canada. And this is sort of a reversal of that trend, but the concerns around low pay and precarity absolutely still exist. We're seeing a growing number of call centers, for example, be set up in the Philippines with major tech companies outsourcing the work there. And there have been a variety of concerns raised by workers about working conditions, about low pay, about safety issues. Some workers talking about, not even being able to take a bathroom break. And these workers, they're not unionized. They have formed a sort of employee group to represent them that has raised concerns about state intimidation and harassment for their work organizing. And so this is a growing trend and one that sees what are already low-wage jobs in North America essentially be sent to an even lower wage environment where working conditions are even more questionable.
So essentially, this is the same story, this new wave of digital outsourcing. Does it pose the same risks of low-cost labor and exploitation that we're seeing in other more traditional enterprises like the garment industry? So basically, nothing has changed in terms of inequities in labor when we talk about this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of this is about finding the cheapest wage. It is, sort of what critics would call a race to the bottom. But, another interesting point when it comes to this digital world or digital economy is that you're not just outsourcing the wages, you're outsourcing the other potential liabilities that come along with this kind of work. So we're seeing this a lot with content moderation, for example. In the US, folks who work as content moderators actually launched a class action over the emotional trauma that they have to sift through material on various platforms. And a lot of it is extremely disturbing content. And they received almost $60 million in sort of payouts for that emotional trauma, recognizing the emotional and mental psychological stress that it causes. But, when companies outsource this work to the Philippines, often through a third-party contractor, they're losing those liabilities and responsibilities for sort of emotional and mental safety. So, it is about wages, but it's also about shedding those other liabilities as well.
And in your piece, the CEO of Tiny Mile mentions that Geoffrey is a model to actually make food delivery accessible and affordable for everyone. But what are the concerns with that kind of affordable business model? Can a profit margin even be possible without someone somewhere down the line paying the price?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it's one that keeps coming up over and over again in my reporting on the gig economy. Obviously, we love convenience. We love low-cost luxuries like food delivery. And of course, no one's going to fault anyone for that. It's a wonderful service. But the reality is that we often don't think about who is paying the price and how are these businesses making it affordable. And generally it is through changing or undermining working conditions. And so I think, stories like this do sort of force us to reckon with our notion of convenience and really think about the bigger picture. Overall, in the short term, is it great to have low cost food delivery? Absolutely. But in the long term, what does this mean in terms of the basic minimum standards that we can all expect on the job? Because the reality is when you erode working conditions for the most vulnerable workers, ultimately it lowers the bar in every workplace. We see this here in Ontario as well, with the rise of independent contractors in the gig economy who are not entitled to any basic protections. We're seeing more and more jobs move towards this classification because employers realize they can save money by telling workers that they're independent contractors and not employees. So I think it is important to really scrutinize our relationship with convenience and really think about what it means for our society in the long term.
Right, outside of the inconvenience. And you also talked about the invisibility of labor. I want to talk about gig workers here. We know that demographically, a lot of that workforce consists of low income, racialized people. What does this mean for their future? Would this labor force need to be restructured? Will they need to learn new skills? What does the future look like?
Yeah, I think that the future is uncertain. We're seeing gig workers really organizing and mobilizing right now around working conditions. And so I think there's definitely a shift in terms of what workers are willing to accept for basic minimum standards. And it's coming at an interesting time because this is a topic that the provincial government is actually examining right now through a new committee that's been formed to sort of look at the future of work. And gig workers have been really engaged in that process, but they're also really concerned that app companies like Uber are going to try and use this opportunity to actually entrench their business models. So there's a lot of organizing around, trying to ensure that doesn't happen. And again, I think it's a question of, what are we going to accept as the bare minimum standard that any worker in this province should expect to earn a living? And I think there's a big question mark over how various governments respond to this. But we, across the world, especially in North America and Europe, we are seeing increasingly the courts and, even some governments say, we need to make some radical change here and, really address the business model that many of these app companies have, advanced and really sort of championed. So we're at a really interesting moment where technology, the pandemic, a greater focus on essential workers are really all sort of converging and making us rethink some of our basic employment standards.
Right, and taking a look at how ethical practices can be implemented in this scenario, because the shift towards automation is happening and we continue to see how AI disrupts the economy. So we need to see how we condition our work environment to that, right? What's the case in support of Geoffrey and automation? Can this coming wave of technological change in the gig industry and elsewhere actually help us create a more equitable world? Is there a way to do that?
I think so. I mean, I think, it's interesting talking to some of the couriers here in Toronto when they first heard of Geoffrey and these sort of opportunities to work as the remote pilot here in Toronto, earning $25 an hour. They were really excited because it was a step up from often sub-minimum wage job as a food delivery courier in Toronto. They have the skills, they're able to navigate the streets of Toronto. They could apply that to be a remote pilot for Geoffrey. So initially it was greeted with some enthusiasm. So I absolutely think that there's a way to make these ventures an opportunity for everyone involved, not just the consumer. But I do think we're at a point where likely it will need some kind of government intervention to set those basic minimum standards, because if you have one company who's paying, $25 an hour and hiring people as employees, and you have another company who's hiring them as independent contractors, which means they don't have to pay minimum wage even, that's a really uneven playing field. And so, I think that increasingly there is going to be an urgent need to spell out what those minimum standards are to really level that playing field.
Sara, you've been so insightful. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I was talking to the Star's Work and Wealth reporter, Sara Mojtehedzadeh. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sara Mojtehedzadeh. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mutter, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.